At 7:30 in the morning on August 10th, 2026, the ground underneath western Colombia tore loose. A magnitude 7.4 earthquake ripped through the Department of Chaco on Colombia's Pacific coast, and within seconds, the shaking had reached cities more than 100 miles away: Cali, Pereira, Manizales, Armenia, Quibdó. Buildings that had stood for decades came down in the span of a few violent seconds. Church facades collapsed onto the streets below them. Hospitals had to evacuate patients mid-treatment. As of the most recent count, more than 224 people are confirmed dead. Over 1,200 have been injured, and more than 3,700 people remain reported missing. 5 of Colombia's capital cities are currently under red alert, the country's highest disaster designation. Colombia's own Geological Service has called it the strongest earthquake to strike the country in the entire 21st century. This isn't a distant abstract statistic. This happened 2 days ago, and it's still happening right now, in the sense that rescue teams are still pulling people from collapsed buildings, aftershocks are still rattling a country that hasn't stopped shaking, and a newly sworn-in president is running his first real national emergency less than a week into office. And this earthquake landed in a part of the world already reeling from a catastrophic seismic event just weeks earlier, when Venezuela was devastated by back-to-back earthquakes that left more than 6,000 people dead. Today, we're going to walk through exactly what happened in Colombia, why this particular earthquake was structurally so dangerous, even though it wasn't especially shallow, what the current death toll and missing persons numbers actually tell us about how disasters like this unfold in real time, why this region of South America sits in one of the most tectonically loaded stretches of the entire Ring of Fire, and what happens next for a country now facing an enormous, sudden humanitarian emergency. No exaggeration, no dramatizing beyond what's already tragically real, just the facts, the geology, and the human stakes. Before we get into it, I want to ask you something we ask every time one of these stories breaks. If you've ever lived through an earthquake, even a small one, drop a comment and tell me where you were and what it actually felt like in that first moment before you understood what was happening. I read every one of these, and there's something important in hearing from people who've actually lived through the thing we're describing from a distance. And if you want to be among the first to know when major geological events like this happen, subscribe to the channel. It's completely free, and it helps us keep covering these stories responsibly and quickly. A thumbs up helps too. Let's get this one to 6,000 likes, so this reaches people who need accurate information instead of recycled panic clips. All right, let's get into it. At approximately 7:30 a.m., local time on Monday, August 10th, the earthquake struck near San Jose del Palmar, a remote town in Colombia's Choco department, a densely forested mountainous region along the country's Pacific coast. The United States. Geological Survey measured the quake at magnitude 7.4, with the Colombian Geological Service confirming the same reading and describing it as the largest seismic event recorded in the country this century. The shaking wasn't confined to the immediate epicenter. It radiated outward with enough force to be clearly felt in Cali, Colombia's third largest city, more than 100 miles from where the rupture began. It reached Pereira and Manizales, cities sitting in Colombia's mountainous, densely populated coffee-growing region. It reached Armenia and Quibdó. It crossed international borders entirely, with reports of shaking felt in neighboring Ecuador, Panama, and even Venezuela, a country still actively recovering from its own devastating earthquake sequence just weeks earlier. The human toll unfolded the way these disasters almost always do, in a grim, rising sequence of updates. Early reports on the day of the earthquake put the death toll at around 20. Within hours, that number had climbed past 100. By the following day, confirmed deaths had risen past 130, then past 160. As of the most recent figures, at least 224 people have been confirmed dead, more than 1,200 have been injured, and more than 3,700 people remain reported missing, a number that, based on the pattern we've seen in every major earthquake disaster this year, is likely to shift substantially as search and rescue operations continue and communication is restored to the hardest hit and most remote areas. Pereira has emerged as one of the most severely affected cities, recording the highest concentration of fatalities in the country, with local officials describing entire buildings collapsing onto residential streets. In Cali, videos verified and geolocated by international news outlets show the exact moment buildings came down, sending clouds of dust and debris across city blocks as residents ran for open ground. In Manizales, the city's historic cathedral sustained visible structural damage to its facade. Across the affected region, authorities have confirmed at least 86 buildings fully collapsed, with more than 1,500 homes damaged and a significant number of those completely destroyed. More than a dozen health centers and an even larger number of schools sustained damage severe enough to be taken out of service entirely, at precisely the moment when functioning hospitals matter most. Colombia's government responded immediately. The country's newly inaugurated president, sworn into office only days before the earthquake struck, announced he was personally taking direct leadership of the emergency response and traveling to the capital to coordinate the national effort. A curfew was put in place across the hardest hit areas, running from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m., intended to protect residents and prevent looting while search and rescue operations continued through the night. Roughly 600 troops were deployed within the first day alone, with hundreds more mobilized to follow, and an additional request for over 200 more personnel submitted as the scale of the disaster became clearer. 7 airports across the affected region had to suspend operations entirely, complicating both the arrival of aid and the evacuation of the most seriously injured. If you've been following our recent coverage of earthquake science, you know that depth is one of the single biggest factors determining how destructive a given magnitude actually turns out to be. A shallow earthquake delivers nearly all of its energy directly to the surface. A deep one loses much of that energy to the rock it has to travel through before it ever reaches the buildings and people above it. This is exactly the distinction that made Venezuela's earthquake sequence in June so catastrophic, with ruptures occurring at a dangerously shallow 10 kilometers. Colombia's earthquake was different. The Colombian Geological Service reported the quake struck at a depth of approximately 103 kilometers, meaningfully deeper than Venezuela's shallow surface-tearing rupture. On paper, that depth should have provided at least some natural cushioning, absorbing a portion of the seismic energy before it reached the surface, and to some degree it likely did. But a magnitude 7.4 carries such an enormous amount of total energy that even with a meaningful chunk of it absorbed by 100-plus kilometers of intervening rock, what reached the surface was still more than enough to bring down buildings across an area spanning multiple cities and more than 100 miles. This is worth understanding clearly because it illustrates something important about how earthquake risk actually works. Magnitude alone never tells the full story, but neither does depth alone. A magnitude, 7.4, is an enormous release of energy under any circumstances. Remember, each whole number step on the magnitude scale represents roughly 31 times more energy, meaning a 7.4 releases energy on a scale that dwarfs the vast majority of earthquakes that make headlines in a given year. Even with depth working somewhat in the region's favor, compared to Venezuela's shallow catastrophe, the raw scale of energy involved was still large enough to produce widespread structural collapse. The region where this earthquake occurred sits directly above one of the most seismically loaded convergence zones on the planet. Colombia's Pacific coast lies along the boundary where the Nazca Plate is being forced underneath the South American Plate, the same broad category of subduction zone tectonics responsible for the largest earthquakes ever recorded anywhere on Earth. This exact stretch of coastline, spanning southern Colombia and northern Ecuador, has a long, well-documented history of major seismic activity. And Colombian geologists have been studying the complex, segmented rupture behavior of this particular subduction zone for decades, going back to foundational research in the early 1980s that first mapped how this specific boundary tends to break in sections rather than all at once. One detail that Colombian officials and international reporters have both pointed to in the aftermath of this earthquake is where, geographically, the worst damage concentrated. The quake struck hardest in what's known locally as Colombia's Coffee Axis, a lush, mountainous region that forms one of the cultural and economic backbones of the country. This same region was the site of a previous devastating earthquake in 1999, a disaster that killed nearly 2,100 people, and remains etched into the national memory of the exact cities now dealing with fresh destruction. That historical parallel matters for understanding both the emotional weight of this disaster inside Colombia and the practical challenges facing the recovery effort. Some of the same cities working through search and rescue operations this week have done this before, which means there's institutional memory and a disaster response experience to draw on. But it also means a region that had spent the past quarter century slowly rebuilding is now confronting a strikingly similar catastrophe in some of the same neighborhoods within a single generation. The geography of the epicenter itself adds another layer of difficulty to the response. Chaco, where the earthquake originated, is one of Colombia's poorest departments, a remote area of dense jungle, where much of the region is only accessible by boat or by air. That isolation, which under normal circumstances shapes daily life across the department, is now actively complicating the most basic task facing rescue teams, simply reaching the communities closest to the epicenter to assess how bad the damage actually is. Officials have been candid that the full scope of destruction and loss of life in these harder-to-reach areas may not become clear for some time, which is part of why the confirmed death toll has continued climbing steadily with each passing day, and why the number of people reported missing, currently exceeding 3,700, remains such a significant and troubling figure. If the way this death toll has climbed over the past 48 hours feels familiar, That's because it follows almost exactly the same pattern we've seen play out in every major earthquake disaster this year, including Venezuela's catastrophic sequence back in June. Initial reports in the immediate aftermath of a major earthquake are always undercounts, not because anyone is hiding information, but because of the basic mechanics of disaster response. In the first hours, officials can only confirm what emergency services have directly observed and processed, typically concentrated in the largest, most accessible cities, where communication infrastructure survived and hospitals are still functioning enough to report incoming casualties. As search and rescue teams gradually reach more remote, harder-hit areas, as communication networks are restored, and as families begin actively searching for missing relatives and reporting them to authorities, the confirmed numbers climb, sometimes dramatically, over the following days and weeks. This is exactly why the current gap between 224 confirmed deaths and more than 3,700 people reported missing is so significant, and why responsible coverage of a disaster like this treats that missing persons figure as seriously as the confirmed death toll itself. Not every missing person will turn out to be a fatality. Some will be found alive, displaced, or simply unable to reach a phone or communicate their location amid disrupted infrastructure. But historical precedent from disasters of this scale and type suggests the final death toll from this earthquake will likely end up meaningfully higher than the number currently being reported, which is part of why Colombian officials themselves have been explicit that these figures are expected to rise as operations continue. If you've been watching our recent videos, you've probably noticed a pattern. Venezuela in June, now Colombia in August, both catastrophic, both in the same general region of the world. It's worth addressing directly whether these events are connected, because it's exactly the kind of question that deserves an honest, scientifically grounded answer, rather than either dismissal or unwarranted alarm. The short answer is that Venezuela's earthquake sequence and Colombia's earthquake are not mechanically connected. Venezuela's disaster occurred along the boundary between the South American plate and the Caribbean plate, a transform fault system running roughly east to west across northern Venezuela. Colombia's earthquake occurred along a fundamentally different boundary, the subduction zone where the Nazca Plate dives beneath the South American Plate along the Pacific coast. These are separate fault systems, driven by separate plate interactions, and there is no established mechanism by which a rupture on one could trigger a rupture on the other, despite occurring in the same general region within a period of about 7 weeks. What connects these two disasters isn't a shared mechanical trigger, it's geography. Northern South America sits at a genuinely complex tectonic crossroads, where the Caribbean Plate, the Nazca Plate, and the South American Plate all interact along different boundaries running through or near the region. Colombia's Pacific coast specifically sits directly along the Ring of Fire, the same roughly 25,000-mile arc of tectonic activity responsible for the overwhelming majority of the world's earthquakes and active volcanoes, the same arc we've discussed in the context of Japan, the Philippines, and California in previous videos. A region this tectonically active experiencing 2 separate, unrelated major earthquakes within a couple of months isn't evidence of some hidden global mechanism activating. It's a sobering reminder of just how much of northern South America sits directly on top of genuinely dangerous, independently active fault systems, each capable of producing a disaster like this one entirely on its own timeline. We've talked before about how the difference between a moderate disaster and a catastrophic one almost never comes down to magnitude alone. It comes down to what was built and how well in the years and decades before the ground ever moved. Colombia's situation sits in a genuinely complicated middle ground on this question, and it's worth being honest about both sides of it. Colombia is not Venezuela. It hasn't experienced the same multi-year economic collapse that left Venezuela's infrastructure maintenance deferred indefinitely and its emergency response systems chronically underfunded. Colombia has a functioning government that mobilized troops, declared emergencies, and coordinated a national response within hours, not days. Its major cities have modern hospitals, an established disaster management framework, and enough institutional capacity to request and effectively coordinate international assistance. But Colombia is also not Japan. Building codes and enforcement vary significantly across the country, and they tend to be weakest in precisely the kind of remote, lower-income, harder-to-monitor regions where this earthquake's epicenter was located. The fact that the hardest-hit epicentral area is one of Colombia's poorest departments, largely accessible only by boat or air, is not a coincidence in terms of how the disaster has unfolded. It's a pattern we've now seen repeat across multiple earthquake disasters this year, where the human cost of a given magnitude correlates closely with the economic conditions and infrastructure quality of the specific communities sitting closest to the rupture. The presence of collapsed hospitals and damaged schools across multiple cities also points to a harder truth. Even in a country with real institutional capacity, Older buildings constructed before modern seismic standards were adopted or consistently enforced remain profoundly vulnerable. And retrofitting that existing building stock is exactly the kind of expensive, unglamorous, multi-decade infrastructure project that's easy to defer until an earthquake like this one makes the cost of not doing it brutally clear. Colombia is now moving into the phase of disaster response that, while less visually dramatic than the initial collapse footage, is often the most difficult to sustain. Search and rescue operations will continue for days, particularly in remote parts of Choco, where reaching survivors trapped in collapsed structures is complicated by geography, infrastructure damage, and the sheer scale of destruction across multiple cities simultaneously. Aftershocks, which Colombian authorities have already confirmed are ongoing, will continue to complicate both rescue efforts and the safety of structures that sustain damage but haven't yet fully collapsed, a genuine hazard for both survivors and the rescue teams working alongside them. The humanitarian needs will shift over the coming weeks from immediate rescue to sustained relief, housing for the more than 1,500 families whose homes were damaged or destroyed, medical care for over 1,200 injured people at a moment when a significant number of the region's health centers are themselves out of service, and psychological support for a population processing a disaster of this scale less than 2 months after watching their neighboring country endure an even larger one. International assistance will play a significant role in how quickly Colombia is able to move through this recovery. The country's relatively strong existing institutions and functioning government give it a meaningfully better starting position than Venezuela had in June. But the scale of destruction, 5 capital cities, under red alert, dozens of confirmed building collapses, and a death toll still climbing, means this will be a recovery measured in months and years, not weeks. This earthquake adds Colombia to a growing list of countries that have experienced major, deadly seismic events in 2026 alone, a list that already includes Venezuela's catastrophic June earthquake sequence, Japan's magnitude 7.4 Senriku earthquake, and continued elevated monitoring of stress, along California's San Andreas fault system. As we've said in each of these stories, this pattern doesn't reflect some unprecedented global shift in the planet's underlying seismic behavior. Earth produces earthquakes of this scale somewhere in the world with statistical regularity, and the Ring of Fire in particular, which runs through or near every one of the countries just mentioned, remains as consistently active as it has been for millions of years. What has genuinely changed and what makes stories like Colombia's earthquake feel so relentless this year is the growing concentration of vulnerable populations living directly along these fault systems, combined with far more sophisticated monitoring and reporting technology than existed even a decade ago. We are not living through an unusually dangerous geological moment. We are living through a moment where the consequences of decades of urban growth along known fault lines are becoming increasingly visible, disaster by disaster, in close succession. Here's what's worth sitting with as we close this one out. 2 days ago, a magnitude 7.4 earthquake tore through western Colombia, and the country is still actively counting its losses, still searching through rubble, still watching numbers that started in the dozens climb past 200 confirmed dead with thousands more unaccounted for. This is a real, unfolding human tragedy, not a distant abstraction, and it's happening to a region of the world that, 7 weeks ago, watched its neighbor endure something even larger. The earthquake itself was the product of forces that have been building along the boundary between the Nazca and South American plates for longer than anyone alive today has been watching. Nothing about the tectonics here is new or unprecedented. What matters now, in the days and weeks ahead, is the same thing that has mattered in every disaster we've covered this year: how quickly aid reaches the hardest to access communities, how thoroughly search and rescue operations can work before the window for finding survivors closes, and how much international support arrives to help a country that, while far better positioned than Venezuela was in June, is still facing a disaster whose full scale isn't yet fully known. We'll continue following this story as new information comes in, including updated casualty figures, the scope of international relief efforts, and any significant aftershock activity along this stretch of the Colombian and Ecuadorian coast. Subscribe so you don't miss any of those updates, and if you have any connection to Colombia, family, friends, or simply people you're thinking of right now, drop a comment. These numbers are always easier to process in the abstract than they are when you remember every single one of them represents someone's home, someone's family, someone's morning that started like any other. Let's get this one to 6,000 likes so this story reaches the people who need accurate information right now. Stay safe, and we'll see you in the next one.